gentlemen, good evening. My name is Olia Hercules. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute, London. We are an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and enables audiences around the world to access nuanced and reliable information about Ukraine. As an independent charity, we rely on your donations, and we are extremely grateful to all of you who support our work. Explaining Ukraine to the world is at the heart of what we do. And that is why we're absolutely delighted to host tonight two people who have been extremely effective in explaining Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history to very varied audiences around the world. Both of our speakers tonight, Serhii Plokhy and Olia Hercules, have been witnessing this war, Russia's war, mostly from afar, from the US and the UK. But they have been affected by it profoundly, not just professionally, but also personally. Bearing witness to atrocities inflicted by Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine, even from afar, comes with a responsibility to share that which one has witnessed. And both of our speakers have embraced this responsibility and have become true ambassadors of Ukraine at a time when Ukrainian voices really need to get all the possible platforms that they can. And so we are absolutely thrilled to be able to partner with How To Academy tonight and create such a platform tonight. And we really look forward to what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. So it's my great honor to introduce the speakers, and I will begin with the moderator of tonight's discussion, MacInnes, who's a broadcaster and journalist. Alongside hosting How To Academy's live programs and podcasts, she presents a cultural show on Times Radio and interviews on stage at a number of other major literary events. She has written for the Radio Times, for the Evening Standard and the TLS. And she's worked for 8 years at BBC Newsnight as planning editor and as a producer and filmmaker. And now it's my honor to introduce our superstars of the evening. I'll begin with Serhii Plokhy. Serhii Plokhy needs no introduction. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Gates of Europe, and Chernobyl, History of a Tragedy. His many acclaimed books, including Nuclear Folly, Atoms and Ashes, and The Last Empire, have been translated into over a dozen languages. He is professor of history at Harvard University, where he also serves as director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And we're also joined tonight by Olia Hercules, who is an author, chef, and activist who writes cookbooks and teaches for a living. She has written 4 books, and her first one, Mamushka, won the Observer's Rising Star in Food Award. Olia is also a co-founder of Cook for Ukraine, a global initiative to raise funds for those affected by Russia's war in Ukraine. And they've already raised nearly £2 million. Is that right? Over £2 million. There you go. My information is already dated, and I checked it yesterday, so there you go. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just very quickly, a very warm welcome again on behalf of How To Academy and the Ukrainian Institute London. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here, a full house. Well done for choosing the wisest possible way to spend your Wednesday evening. It's truly a huge honour to be hosting this discussion with two people who I admire, I know we all admire so much, on such an important subject. But perhaps most importantly, it prompted me to read this truly fascinating book that is really the inspiration for our discussion this evening. Some of you will have read it, many of you have the treat in store, but it is a comprehensive and truly compelling look at the roots, the context of the war, which is so essential to our understanding of it, as we will see. So it is such a pleasure to be able to delve into the mind that wrote it and from which it came, and also, of course, to have Olia with us too is a huge treat. We're very honoured. So thank you both very much again from me. Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Okay, wonderful. I think you two will need to pick up your microphones. So if we could just start by just asking you, Serhii, you say in this book, I take a long approach to understanding the current war. I decline the temptation to identify the date of February the 24th, 2022 as its beginning. I just wonder if you could explain why you wanted to write it and why you felt it was important to take that approach.
First of all, thank you for this introduction, thank you for this question, thanks for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here, honor. Again, I wish that book would written on a different topic, that the topic that it discussed would not be there. But we are already in the 9th year of the war and the 2nd year of the all-out Russian aggression against Ukraine. And it's very important to really understand, as you said, how did we get here? What are the causes? And also very important, in my opinion, to understand what is Ukraine and why it surprised really almost everyone by its resilience. And this is the country with really old and ancient history and culture, and Olia's work on Ukrainian cuisine, certainly that's one more manifestation of that. In terms of the start of the war, it didn't begin in February of 2022. It started in February of 2014 with the Russian special forces taking over the buildings of the Crimean parliament and Crimean government, dragging in the members of the parliament, Crimean parliament, into that building and forcing them to vote. And at that point, they couldn't force them to vote for either independence or joining Russia, independence of Crimea. I mean, it was about the changes to the Russian, to the Ukrainian constitution and constitution of the Crimea. But that was the beginning. That was the start, which was unfortunately not certainly missed by Ukrainians and Ukrainian society. That's a separate story. But it was very much missed by the West. And my personal conviction is that the sort of solidarity, the sort of response that Russia got in February of 2022, if it would get it in February 2014, probably we would not be here today discussing this particular book and certainly witnessing and participating to a degree possible in what is happening today in Ukraine.
Yes, I would say as much as your book is fascinating, it is intensely frustrating a lot of the way through because of what you've just said and missed opportunities, and I'd love to come back to that. But Olia, I know that you have read the book and it had a huge impact on you, and I wonder if you could explain why you felt it so important and want to, I suppose, press it into the hands of everyone in the room and people that you know.
Sure. So the advance copy of the book came at a very, very good time. For the past year, I've actually been researching and documenting my own family history. And just for those who don't know, I'm from the south of Ukraine. I'm from Khersonshina. My hometown, Kakhovka, is still occupied. And I thought that it was time to actually really delve into local history and my own history and to write it down. So, I was already covered with all of these books around my desk, and including Serhii's other books. And then this book comes in and I'm like, aha, okay, this is great, this is fantastic. I read it, and, I kept writing my own thing. And actually, quite a lot of it, my own history and reading Serhii's book, it's not an easy thing to do for a Ukrainian. It's actually quite triggering, and in a way, I kept on re-traumatizing myself as well. But what I loved about the book and the feeling that it gives me hope, and I've kind of, as I was writing my own history, I've kind of decided that I'm going to close this cycle of intergenerational trauma. I've just made a decision. I decided that in the future, not now, I'm still going through the motions, but in the future, I want to kind of cherish the history, but not carry it through to my children, for example. I don't know if that makes sense. So there's a really great quote by Dr. Edith Eger, who's a Holocaust survivor. and she went to visit Auschwitz. And there's a sentence that I really loved, and she says, in that moment, the past didn't taint the present, but the present didn't diminish the past. And I thought that it was an amazing sentence, and I kind of clung on to it, and I thought, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to pass on the trauma, but there's books like Serhii's, where it is history, and he's a professional historian, and it's in many ways it's looking at everything objectively, but there's also a feeling, there's also you've experienced, you've lived in Ukraine, you've experienced it, your family has experienced it, and it's really important to have books like this that I can give to my children, and they can kind of look at history in a special way like that. I hope that made sense, but I love the book.
I should ask, perhaps, if you might explain why you chose this title. This is a very specific reason, and you say that the sort of idea that this is the Russian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, isn't the right way to see it.
Yes, first of all, Olia, thank you. And in terms of the title, there is no good titles for the war, any war. They're just the nature of things that you try to describe in a few short words. Everything is problematic. What was important for me in this title was that, for me, it's very much about the positive surprise that came to the world immediately after the all-out war started and all-out aggression. Because one thing that the politicians anywhere in the world, from Washington to London to Brussels to Moscow, sort of had an agreement on, that Ukraine would not last for a long period of time, that Kiev would fall in a few days. The best hopes were there that there maybe would be a resistance. The US and UK and I and other Ukrainians are certainly very grateful for that support, were sending before the war the weapons that could be used for the partisan warfare. Those were expectations. And what everyone discovered, that Ukraine actually was there, that Ukraine didn't surrender, that it wasn't just a groups of the partisans running around and fighting here and there, that there was a state that could function under the stress, that could function under attacks, that there was the army that was fighting and was after the immediate retreat eventually learned how to win. And in that sense, it wasn't just a Russian war in Ukraine. It wasn't just a Russia going somewhere into some province, into some place, and conducting that war. What they found was Ukraine as a state, as an army, and in that sense, that title for me is about changing the perspective on Ukrainian history as well, through this war, where Ukraine is an agent. Ukraine is not just a place, it's not just a victim, it is a victim of that unprovoked attack, but it refused to become a victim. And that's the meaning that I was putting into that title. But as I said, the nature of the war is such that there are no good titles for any war, big or small. Thank you.
Can I get both of your reflection on why that is? Because what you suggest is that between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine became a very different society. And I think you were a huge part of this cultural sense of unity that came about between 2014 and 2022. And it seems to be a large part of the reason that that we're still where we are and that the 2 to 3 days didn't happen.
Yeah, 2014 was, definitely the beginning, and definitely the beginning of all of us changing in a very significant way. So I grew up in the south of Ukraine. I grew up speaking the Russian language, and Zaporizhzhia is also, a Russophone a city where Serhii is from. And I grew up with my grandparents' stories. So, from my grandmother being deported from Mykolaiv to Karelia in the early 1920s, to my granddad being sent to a gulag, etc., etc. So, I've always felt Ukrainian. I've always felt that, opposition to, I don't know, like the Soviet rule, etc., etc. But we spoke Russian, and it was in 2014 where I think we were all just a little bit, not a little bit, quite a lot actually shaken. And it was then that we made a decision that switching to speaking Ukrainian and actually actively learning so much more about Ukrainian history, about Ukrainian literature, about Ukrainian culture, which has been suppressed so heavily, by the Soviets, especially in those areas in the south and east of Ukraine. The standardization policy, was particularly kind of rife there. For example, when my parents in the Mykolaiv region, they grew up in Voznesensk, when they were little and they went to school, there were 10 schools, only one of them was Ukrainian, and it was the worst. It was the lowest kind of, level of education that was given there, less years you had to go. And in the Russian, centric school, if anybody spoke Ukrainian, you'd be bullied. You'd be called Seluk or Seluchka, which means a peasant, and, you wouldn't get anywhere. Going to university or getting a better job than other jobs, if you were a Ukrainian speaker, wasn't the thing. So still, I grew up speaking Russian. And in 2014, we just went, okay, it's going to be hard, but we need to do it. And we need to make these small steps and small changes. And, I tried, and then it was hard, and then I had children, and then I was just like, brain fog, and I was like, okay. And I think in 2022, it was kind of like a culmination of something that started, a little, little embryo of all of those thoughts and feelings, and it just kind of exploded. And I can tell you that a year since the continuation of the war, I even had my first thought in Ukrainian the other day, and it felt very, very good indeed.
I mean, I'd love to hear your reflections on that. It's the language is such a huge part. I mean, you say in the book that the ideological slogan of the war was the protection of Russian speakers allegedly oppressed, which just clearly, so evidently became not the case.
Yes, indeed. In 2014 was a huge turning point. At Harvard, at the Ukrainian Research Institute, we were conducting polling, and we have MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine project. We were trying to map it and see in time what was happening. And there was spike in 2014, 2015 of people self-reporting speaking Ukrainian. And then it went down, exactly as what you described. So that's what we are getting from the most of Ukraine, south and east. But 2022 was a turning point, and it's very interesting. There is a particular tension, and there is a dynamic, but there is a tension. Ukraine back in 2014 and today fights the war in two languages, in Ukrainian and Russian. And it survived the assault because it was it mobilized across the ethnic, religious, and linguistic lines. But at the same time, that resistance also lifted suddenly Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture to this level, to the status, to the place that it wasn't there before. And I can tell you just from my own experience with my books, I write them in English. All of them by now are translated into Ukrainian. But even before 2014, the publishers were always asking, okay, can you maybe help and provide subsidy? And I was trying to help. I don't remember after 2014 anyone doing that, because there was the market, there was the demand, there was this really enormous enormous interest in Ukrainian history. So it was a turning point in many ways. And again, on the one hand, Ukraine continues to be a very pluralistic society in many ways, but it's also clearly that Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture are on the rise. And it's really makes a lot of sense, given that the war started with the claim that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, which meant that Ukrainians didn't exist as a nation, that Ukrainians are really Russians, and the task was to defend the Ukrainians who don't know that they're Russians from the oppression. And we know that narrative certainly collapsed, and it collapsed on the battlefield in Ukraine. The sad irony of the whole story is that the war that started with the idea of defending Russians, the Russian speakers actually were and are among the most affected by this war, by its negative consequences. Mariupol, the city that almost doesn't exist today, before the war, not only it was Russian-speaking city predominantly, but the ethnic Russians constituted 44% of the population. Thinking about Kharkiv, the second largest Ukrainian city, mostly Russophone. And this is the matter now for Ukraine, for Ukrainian culture, for Ukrainian nation of survival. Survival physical, but also survival spiritual and survival cultural. And the nation got mobilized in many ways, not just militarily, not just in terms of the resistance, the aggression, but also in cultural terms. That's a revival of a sort is happening, including cultural life on many levels.
Do you want to reflect on that, or just before I come to you to sort of reflect on identity, perhaps you could explain where this, I suppose, myth really came from of it being one entity that Putin really used as justification. You go into such detail in the book, and as I said before, we need so many more hours than we have to, of course, kind of get the complete picture. But you talk about really the way in which there was a bridge between imperial notions of Russian language, culture, and identity, and views that began to become popular in the Kremlin with the arrival of Putin, which justified the war, but as we're saying, weren't exactly based in reality.
Yes, indeed. The argument that Putin put forward is not original at all. It's bizarre in the 21st century, but it comes really from the Russian imperial thinking and writing of the 19th century. Because when in the 19th century the formation of the modern nation started in Eastern Europe in general, and the empire was challenged by the rising Ukrainian movement, cultural, political, and otherwise, the way to deal with the rising national awareness, not just in Ukraine, but in other places as well, was to come up with the idea that there existed one big Russian nation consisting of three quote-unquote tribes. The Great Russians, so today's Russians, Ukrainians, they were called Little Russians, and Belarusians, so White Russians. And the idea was, okay, they could speak different languages and dance different dances, but at the end of the day, they were all Russians. And so you allow to a degree for some elements of Ukrainian culture, but certainly you claim that politically this is one nation. And Putin brings back this ideas of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and tries to not just rewrite history, tries to redo history, bringing these ideas of the 19th century back. And somewhere in the book, I'm talking about this war as being a 19th century war in terms of ideology, a 20th century war in terms of the military tactics, and 21st century in terms of the use of cyber weapons and weapons in general, and media, social media, for fighting this war.
I know you have reflections on where this led you in your sort of search for identity.
Yes, it's Putin has such an archaic kind of vision of of us as fraternal nations, and he just doesn't understand what being Ukrainian means. It's maybe a few months ago I decided to do a DNA test, mainly because my paternal grandmother is originally from Siberia. She moved to Uzbekistan, met my Ukrainian grandfather, and she lived in Voznesensk in Ukraine her whole life. And actually, her whole life she identified, she said, I'm Childon. And I didn't, does it mean Человек Dona, a person from the Don River, or what does it mean? I don't know. And I just thought, interesting. Let's see if, I don't know how accurate these things are, whatever. I did it, and it was fascinating in a way. The first 10 regions that came up was Ukraine, and it was Lviv and Kiev, which actually I don't know any of my family that were born there. The second one is 10 Polish regions, then 10 Belarusian regions, and 10 Russian regions, and 25% Mediterranean, because I have Moldovan great-grandmothers, And, it was fascinating, especially to see those western regions of Ukraine and Poland for me. But at the same time, it didn't really matter, because that's not what makes me Ukrainian. It's not about genetics. It's not about. It's my state of mind. It's how I understand and see the world. It's what I have absorbed from my family, which was, love of freedom and just liberal views, really. And it's it was a fascinating thing to do, but it doesn't really matter. And I think they really don't get it.
Do you think
they don't?
You say they.
Russians. I mean, the occupiers, the attackers. Whoever supports the war and believes the narrative.
And you were saying earlier, and as you mentioned in the book, instead of inspiring, as Putin might have expected, gratitude for sort of this fraternal assistance, you write, the war helped destroy a number of Russian imperial and Soviet myths. Instead of arresting the development of the Ukrainian nation and destroying its commitment to sovereignty, the Russian invasion in general and the assault on Kyiv in particular strengthened the people's sense of identity and unity, endowing it with a new raison d'etre, new narratives, new heroes and martyrs. And that seems to be your experience, that since 2022 it has strengthened your sense of identity.
100%. I mean, to be honest with you, it's always been really strong. I left Ukraine when I was 12, and I lived in Cyprus actually for 5 years, and I got into an international school, and I remember a questionnaire that they gave me, and they said, "What's your first language?" And I was stunned. I just sat there, and I felt really strange. I was only like 12, 13, and I just thought, I really don't know what to answer. And I think I put Ukrainian, even if it wasn't true, really. I mean, Russian was my first language. That's what I spoke with my parents. And I came back home and I asked my mom, and I just said, why? Why? I had to, but I felt I couldn't put Russian in because I feel Ukrainian. So what, that was my first kind of awakening, and kind of, even though my parents and my grandparents have always told the stories of, quite horrific personal history that we've had. But this question of language, we just kind of like skimmed over it a bit, And I think that was the first time that my mom sat down and actually told me about her experiences, told me about what it was like for them to be in school in the Soviet Union. And, my grandparents spoke Ukrainian, but it was better to speak Russian because you got a little bit more ahead, in the Soviet Union. And so that was kind of like the first kind of feeling of, okay, I'm just really going to start thinking about my identity. And then when I lived in Cyprus, and then when I came to the UK as well, a lot of the time you'd say, oh, I'm Ukrainian, and they say, oh, so Russian. It really, it really grinds your gears. And post 2014 and post, especially, in the past year, it's become a lot easier to actually explain your identity to people and to keep discovering it.
We're interested to hear your reflections on that experience.
I'm really astonished to what degree what Olia is saying, and this is our first real conversation, to what degree it also reflects my experiences, not only our reading of contemporary situation, but also my experiences. And the story was simple. Grandparents speak Ukrainian. Parents who went to the university speak Russian. My mother graduated from a Ukrainian school, entered medical school in Simferopol, from all places, was doing exams in Ukrainian. They did that, but then she had to relearn everything, physics, chemistry, everything to graduate from the medical school. With the graduating from the Ukrainian school, that means that university higher education is closed for you, right? So there is a discussion whether Ukraine was a colony, whether it wasn't a colony. Well, look at the school system. Look at what was happening, especially in particular parts of Ukraine. But what that did, that produced also sort of the civic identity and later political identity that, as we said, they don't get it. They think about the nation in terms of the 19th century. Language equals nation. You speak Russian, you are probably Russian, you are supposed to welcome the Russian troops. When in Ukraine, a number of generations spoke Russian, but continued to feel themselves to be Ukrainian. That again, something that became really very important in 2014, continues to be important today. But as I said, also there is a rethinking and reevaluation what language means and what culture means. And it can't be otherwise when the wars are started, at least on the pretense that because you speak a particular language, we are here to liberate you. and people are switching. Again, it's with younger generation, I noticed that started already in 2014. And in 2022, the older generation is doing the same. Again, we don't have yet statistics. We have some statistics on Kyiv, for example. Again, it's self-reporting, but the majority population in Kyiv report themselves to be speaking Ukrainian. Older generation of people are saying fleeing Chernihiv and other places. We don't have to speak the language of aggressors. So there is a very, very profound change happening in that regard.
At the beginning, we talked a little bit about the role of the international community. Perhaps you could explain this frustration that really does come through until a sort of turning point, I think, in the book, a much more positive time. But you talk about Bucharest in the summer of 2008 as a really quite distressing time, I think, for Ukraine. And you go on to talk about 2014 as a time which has been compared to the Anschluss. And then again at the start of the war, these pleas from Zelensky, don't scream about this so much, he says to the Americans. Do you see a threat? Give us 10 planes a day, not 1 but 10, and the threat will disappear. To me, those felt like 3 very, very frustrating times where, looking back, perhaps a lot could have been avoided. And I wonder if that's what you were feeling as you were writing.
Yes, unless I'm mistaken, Ukraine still waits for that first plane. Yeah, frustration is probably. I was trying to hide it, yeah, but it looks like I failed at least in that regard. What you see there, and I will talk even earlier. There was such thing as Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Ukraine inherited the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world and gave it away for a piece of paper called Budapest Memorandum, where the not guarantees but assurances were given to protect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. What that really was, in my opinion, because removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine, and nuclear weapons are about deterrence, that's about keeping aggressors at bay. A major security vacuum was created in the center of Europe. The weapons were removed under pressure coming from the United States and moved to Russia at the time when Russia was making claims on the Crimea and on the Ukrainian territories. So that was happening around the same time. And the security vacuum was there and became a sort of invitation for aggression, because Ukraine was now not protected by anything, by those promises that turned out to be empty promises. I compare that to someone actually coming to the wall in the building, punching a huge hole in that wall, and then put in a wallpaper and saying, okay, everything is fine, it looks good, we move on. That wallpaper was Budapest Memorandum. And then you move further, you get 2008 Russian aggression against Georgia. What happens? Well, Germany in particular builds Nord Stream 1. That was the vision how you assure peace. Russia takes over Crimea. What Germany does? Builds Nord Stream 3. Sorry, Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 3 probably would come if Kyiv would fall in the 2 or 3 days. So there is a lot of reasons to be maybe frustrated or upset, but I tried not to show that.
I remember in 2022 that amidst all the emotion, I think you had that sense of frustration that this was coming and that people were just understanding it now, and why hadn't we been understanding it previously to that?
Yeah, 2014 in particular for us, for my family and me, yeah, it was frustrating. It was really scary as well. I'm the type of person, I'm not scared of many things, but that was the first time where I was absolutely terrified, I think. So Kakhovka is, where Kakhovka is, they've built a big dam and a North Crimean canal, and they were, feeding the water into Crimea because they deported all the Crimean Tatars in the 1940s. And they didn't know what to do with Crimea, how to extract water. Crimean Tatars actually had a very sophisticated and gentle, incredible way of extracting water. Russia didn't understand. They were like, okay, so let's do transformation of nature. We build all these dams. We're gonna send water through. And in 2014, when they annexed Crimea, we were on the edge. To be honest with you, we were ready. My mom said, I'm going to come out with the, pitchfork and the frying pan, but it didn't happen. But that was the moment when it felt particularly scary. And of course, we know that what happened in 2022, what we feared finally happened. My mom and dad lived in Kakhovka, in February when it happened. They were actually here in the UK in January, and I begged them, and I said, why don't you just stay for an extra month, and, let's just wait it out, even though none of us really believed, honestly. Not until, I don't know, maybe a couple of days before, we just refused to. How can it be? How is it possible? In a country like Ukraine, I know I always make this example, and maybe it's a silly one, but I just say, my nephews were like having flat whites in Kiev and doing their business plan or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it was like anywhere else in Europe. You just couldn't imagine that it was going to happen. So my parents were there in February in Kakhovka, and at first they were going out and protesting. And then it became too dangerous, and my dad actually got a phone call from the new mayor, the collaborator, and he said, we hear that give us the keys to your, my mom has a little B&B business, and they said, give us the keys. And he said, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. And they said, well, we know that your son is in Kiev and that he's in territorial army, so basically they threatened, we're going to come for you and take you to the basement or whatever. So that was quite a frustrating moment as well. That's when I basically just lost it a bit and made them leave whilst it was still possible. It was April, and it was just a couple of days after they've discovered everything that happened in Bucha, and I just said, okay, you have to leave now. After this phone call, you have to go. You have to pack, and what did they do? They packed a suitcase of photographs, a suitcase of mom's embroideries, some clothes, packed it in the car. It took 16 checkpoints, so a normal trip from Kakhovka to Kherson would take an hour. It took them 19 hours. They broke through Snehurivka, and they drove through Europe, to see my family in Italy. And it was an ordeal. And now the Russian occupiers, the soldiers, are living in our house. And every single day, I think, especially during winter, because we have a summer kitchen and there's a wood-burning stove there, And they were living there apparently because of this wood burning stove. And every single day I thought, are they burning my books? Are they chopping down the orchard trees? Are they using it to heat themselves up? It's a really, frustrating is probably not the word, but yeah, this has been our experience.
You talk about your friends and everyone drinking flat whites and just not imagining it would happen. And you say in the book that despite Biden and the Americans were saying it's going to happen, and Zelensky too did not think it was going to happen until that morning, and he's doing his tie-up and his wife comes in and it's the one moment he thinks it's going to happen. I wonder if you could explain why people were so convinced against the evidence it wouldn't happen.
Well, I'm still trying to understand that, and also going through my own experience. On the one hand, and it's in the book, the night before the invasion, I call my sister and asking, okay, whether the gasoline is there. So clearly, I'm thinking that it can happen. But then when it happens, it's still shock and it's surprise, and it's all at the same time. You think that it's a possibility, but you want to think that it would not happen, because it is to a degree so unthinkable on many levels. And the American edition of this book, the subtitle is "The Return of History," and a lot of us, or at least I judge by myself and people with whom I can believe that some sort of end of history came, the history of violence, the history of annexation, the history of unprovoked wars, and especially when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. No one in Ukraine believed that Ukrainians didn't exist. No one believed that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. But there was the idea that the two nations were pretty close. You don't wage that sort of wars. And on the top of everything else, this is the largest war in Europe since World War II. Didn't we all believe that wars like that were impossibility, that they can't happen anymore? So yeah, whatever way is that you try to prepare yourself, at the end when it happens, it turns out to be inadequate because it's not, you are preparing yourself rationally, but some deep down you think probably no, it can't happen. And now that it happened, now that Ukraine survived through that shock, well, it's a new reality. It's a new reality. It's a new war. It's a people's war very much.
A new reality, which obviously begs the question before it's your questions, and I should have said at the start, I can't dominate this whole conversation, and I do wish it could go on for a very long time because there is so much to discuss, but there will be a time in a moment for your questions. But the new reality, you talk in the book, of course, and people will want to know your thoughts about where this is going. You talk both about how it has hugely and forever impacted the world order. But first, I just wonder if you could explain your thoughts on what you think, where and if the end will be.
Yeah, we historians very often struggle with the task of predicting the past, right? And sometimes I'm more successful, sometimes less successful. So thinking about the future, it's additional challenge. And what I can tell that I basically very optimistic about the medium to long-term future. I'm very concerned about the immediate future. And the long-term, my optimism comes from the fact that, first of all, Ukraine survived as a state, as a nation, when the majority, not majority, but very many people in the world didn't believe that that would happen, that it would last for more than 2 weeks. There is very clear that the process of integration into Europe on many levels, from the European Union to NATO, is something that is taking place today. Ukrainians on one level is more integrated into NATO than any other country that is member of the NATO. Only Ukrainians can fight with all the varieties of the weapons of coming from different NATO countries. No one else can do that. So that is already the reality, and that process will continue. So Ukraine survived. Ukraine will continue. It will be a free country. It will be a democratic country. It will be integrated into the European structures. We also know that the second most powerful army in the world, Russian one, proved to be only the second most powerful army in Ukraine. So there is a really diminishing stature on the military level, economic, political, prestige, whatever you take of Russia. So that's also a reality. The question was about the future, but I am telling you about the developments that already happened, about the tendencies that are probably will become even stronger than they are today, than they are now. So yes, I'm optimistic for Ukraine for the future. What will happen tomorrow, we don't know. We all, those who follow events in Ukraine, think about the counteroffensive. Think about the liberation of Kakhovka. Think about getting to the pushing the line further away from Kherson and Zaporizhia and Mykolaiv that are being bombarded not just by missiles but by long-range artillery. And we hope that it will be successful. But it is war. It is war, and Ukrainians had a number of successes since July of the last year, just one after another. Kherson, before that Kharkiv, and before that certainly the battle for Kiev. But it's war. We have to be prepared, and hopefully it will end soon, but it can last also longer. So that's not about prediction about the future, but that's the something that we have to think and have to be prepared when we think about this future, and that is in the long term it will all work out. But today, to save lives, to shorten the war, we have to redouble our efforts. I talk about Ukraine certainly, but I talk about the support here in UK, in the world in general, because there are two components why Ukrainians are able to fight so effectively. First of all, the mobilization and spirit of people in Ukraine. Second is the help and assistance coming from the West.
Two things which you can certainly reflect on within Ukraine. I know that you've mentioned your brother briefly, but with the conversations you have with him, and do you feel the same sort of sense of optimism?
Oh, absolutely. It's so different in Ukraine as well. I think almost having this distance can make you more anxious. I know it sounds weird, but he hasn't wavered from day one. You know, when he phoned me and he said, actually, you know what, I'm not leaving Kiev. I'm going to join the territorial army and I'm going to fight. And he was, you know, the battle for Kiev. He was there, you know, running around in the forest near Bucha somewhere, and all sorts of things happening. But he's been positive. And almost every single day he'd send me a message that is just full of optimism and strength. And I'm so grateful to him. You know, sometimes I'd be like completely on the floor and, you know, experiencing an episode, and he'd just always be this calm presence. And I'm so grateful to him. And I really hope that, you know, psychologically Ukrainians, as I say, you know, hopefully with the war it will finish, and in the long term this cycle of abuse stops as well. And that we, you know, going back to that thought of the present, the past not tainting the present of us Ukrainians in the future, but also people, you know, remembering the past and kind of keeping it close. So, yeah, and I think that Serhii's book has done that for me. You know, it's kind of like given me hope, and also your beautiful introduction, which was so personal. I thought it was so important to do that. You know, you describing the day when you found out about the war. It helped me to cope. So yeah, here's to Ukrainians helping each other cope, and thank you everyone in the UK and all over the world for helping us too.
I feel like you just brilliantly led it into the question time with that ending. As I say, much to discuss. There's lots in the book, and you can chat to these two perhaps afterwards a little bit as well if you have more questions. You know, on the world order, the international community's help that they've started to give, and of course, Cook for Ukraine, which if you don't know about it, I'm sure you all do. I highly recommend you look it up. There's so many things that you could be part of, and I think a lot more happening, which will be announced soon. So follow Cook for Ukraine. Okay, we have some microphones, and I'm just going to leave it to them to raise your hands high, and we'll get through as many as possible. We started a little bit late, so we'll run over. I hope no one's racing for a train for probably 10 minutes.
Hi, my name is Edina. I'm from Crimea, based in London. Why is it important for Ukraine to gain control of Crimea?
I don't think we heard quite so well. Why is it important for Ukraine to gain control of Crimea?
Well, they will never leave us alone if we don't. Then I will never be able to return home. The whole of area of Khersonщина as well, they need it in order to be able to get water into Crimea. If they don't, it's not viable. It's not. They're already struggling a lot. There's, Crimea in many ways is kind of like on the cusp of ecological collapse. There's chemical plants that are, they don't have the technology. They're using, salted water badly filtered to produce chemicals. That there've been loads of accidents and disasters. And actually, the Russian military is using quite a lot of the fresh water that they can get. There's rusty water falling out of people's taps. It's a real shit show, sorry for the word, but it is. And if we don't regain control of Crimea, if it doesn't come back, if Crimean Tatars are not finally left alone, the long-suffering people of Crimea, it's never going to finish. That's my kind of like opinion, but...
Yeah, I can add maybe in terms of geostrategical considerations. Crimea was turned into a military base. That is right there. It was used as a base to start the war in 2014, then to attack Ukraine in 2022 and capture a good part of southern Ukraine. So keeping Russian troops there means actually keeping Ukraine vulnerable for the future. Two major attacks already came, one in 2014, another in 2022. So what can be the rationale to continue actually this extremely threatening situation for Ukraine in the future? And another thing that I wanted to say that Crimea is extremely important part of Ukraine because of the Crimean Tatars, but also in terms of the personal experiences of the most of Ukrainians, that everyone talks about how Crimea is important for Russia, for Putin, but in terms of the personal experience, it's Ukrainians who actually were going to the Crimea on the yearly basis for vacation. Those were not Russians. That is the most visited part of Ukraine by all Ukrainians, including for the breaks, spring breaks at the universities and so on and so forth. We all, especially in southern Ukraine, grew up thinking about Crimea in a very practical terms. That's where we travel. That's where we know our friends. So when the talk is there about somehow it's so important for Russia to take Crimea away, it would be impossible. That's another red line here and there. I was there. This is not true. There were no Russians after '91, or very little Russians in the Crimea coming on vacation. It were people from Ukraine. So geostrategy. Ukraine would continue to be vulnerable if the Russian military bases continue to be in the Crimea. And it's part of Ukraine that very few Ukrainians are prepared to give up.
Yeah, thank you all very much indeed. I made an awful lot of notes. To move you and Grant, I worked several times in Ukraine from Kyiv for various European Union programs. I have seen very much the dark side of the European Commission, and I share the frustration of officials in Kyiv about the behaviour of some European Union officials. My question is, what is your message or messages to Chancellor Scholz? I would urge everybody in this room to read the Alex Dryden books, starting with Red to Black. You will understand why I asked the question.
Did you hear?
Yes. I heard the question loud and clear. The message is that he is on the right track finally, and he has to actually keep moving and keep moving faster on that track. And in broader terms, what I want to say that if there was frustration about something, really the German position originally, and then the reluctance to support Ukraine, to go beyond the words, to go beyond the pronouncements, that was really frustrating. But also looking at the situation with an eye of a historian, this is quite important and historical turn in the German self-identification. They're thinking about their role in Europe and the world. A change of a paradigm that was there pretty much since 1945. And as a historian, I know that to change that position, this is a big ship. It turns quite slowly, but I also find some sort of optimism in that, because once that ship turns, it does turn. And the message is the same: stay the course. You finally found the right course, and keep doing what you have promised. So that's the message.
Jonathan, so we've consistently underestimated Ukraine, overestimated Russia's capabilities. Might we also be underestimating the revolution of dignity? The broad sweep of European history, might that be seen as a pivotal moment, like the 1848 revolutions and 1917 in future?
Good question. I don't have a ready answer. But what I want to say that really that's the time, that's the place where the change started for Ukraine, and eventually now this is something that resulted in the war and transformation of Europe in general. But there is also other thought that I have, and that's about the importance of Europe and not European institutions per se, but the importance of Europe as an ideal, as a model for Ukraine and the Ukrainian society, which was about not European institutions or Germany or any particular country that stayed in EU or left EU. It was about set of values, including the ideas of the rule of law and so on and so forth. And the revolution of 2014 started as Euro revolution. The idea was to bring Europe to Ukraine. And one of my colleagues said, where else in Europe or in European Union there were people who were prepared to risk their lives and die under the banner of European Union? nowhere else but in Ukraine. And what that means for me, again, it wasn't for institutions per se. It was for a set of values that I associated traditionally with Europe. And that is something that I think very important and turned out to be very important not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe, speaking in the broadest possible terms, institutionally and otherwise. Because this war really reminded to many people, including in the United States and Canada, but in Europe as well, that there are such things as values, there are such ideas as freedom, for which people are prepared to fight and for which people are prepared to die. And I don't think that that sort of experience was out there in Europe or anywhere else since 1945. So thanks for this question. It made me think about 2014 in the ways that I maybe didn't think before.
Sorry, yeah,
Just very, very quickly, just wanted to mention Georgia as well, and I think that we can feel the ripples of what Ukrainians did in 2014. You know, look at, obviously the war as well is influencing what's happening now, but there have been like some really, really strong protests and this strong opposition and an opinion that Georgia should be part of EU, you know, and I feel like what Ukrainians did in 2014 was, just to make people realize that it's possible, that you hold the power, you know, and you can do it.
Sorry, I think we need to wait for a microphone.
On his recent tour of European states capitals, President Zelensky paused to meet with Pope Francis in the Vatican. I've been struck throughout the whole of this saga that the papacy has not been forceful enough to condemn and to issue statements against, unequivocal statements against what the Russians have perpetrated. And I was wondering whether you could explain this reluctance on the part of the papacy to be a bit more forceful. Is it something to do with their relations with the Russian Orthodox Church?
Thank you.
I guess this is...
This is for you.
This is for me. Well, in Ukraine, many people felt that even before the war, that their treatment, in particular by Rome, really was dependent on Rome's idea of recreate the former Roman Empire and reunify the Christianity, recreate in those sense in religious and spiritual, and that they and their interests were sacrificed. And from that point of view, that's just one more situation which continues to be very, very frustrating. And in that sense, that's a feeling that many in Ukraine really feel. And the message from the president of Ukraine, as far as I understand, was that well, you just can't equate victim and aggressor. That this is wrong. Christian, non-Christian, whatever way you look at that, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, this is not the right approach. But what we see, it's also I'm thinking about papacy, of course, as a spiritual center, but also as one of many international organizations and institutions. And many of them turned out to be not up to the task or the challenge that came with the war. You look at the International Atomic Energy Agency, that for 2 or 3 days wouldn't know how to spell word Russia, and was after the takeover of the Chernobyl, after Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, was calling on both sides to exercise caution. So that's the issue that we have with general our international institutions as a whole, whether it's secular, whether this is religious. And I really hope that what is happening in Ukraine will force those institutions, religious or otherwise, take sides and be on the side of victim, be on the side of good. It's the war that is so clear in moral terms to a degree that no other war probably was since 1945. And trying to somehow raise above the conflict and start talking on the one hand, on the other hand, and there are two parties and there are two truths, and they have to be somehow taken into account, whether this is church, whether this is TV, whether this is media, whether this is social media. I think this is the time to move beyond this idea that, okay, probably both sides have some truth. Maybe there is. We didn't listen long enough to Mr. Putin, and that's why this is all happening. So we entered this war in sort of postmodern, post-truth state of mind, and I think it's time to go back and to understand that there is truth and there are lies, and certain things are just that, truth and lies.
Hi. Can I just pick a little bit on your point about optimism about the future and what's going to happen next? You said something about being very optimistic in the medium long term. Of course, in 1918, everyone was optimistic about Germany, and they were destroyed. They were on their knees. They made massive operations, and then 20 years later, we had another problem, another war, and this was sort of addressed in 1945. So do you see, how do you solve the Russia problem? Is it sort of Moscow divided by the Moscow Wall, East-West Moscow and Ukrainian military bases in Russia, or is it some other scenario?
How do we fix Russia?
How do you solve the Russia problem?
Okay. How do you solve Russia problem?
Okay, these are simple questions.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And then the connection come to the 1945
Yeah.
and the Germans and Russians never had to apologize. They never apologized. I think that's they never admitted what they've done.
Well, I don't have answer to that, so I'll tell you maybe a couple of things in terms of my own thinking in that process. In terms of 1945, I come from the family where my grandfather fought in the Red Army. The other grandfather was involved in the Lend-Lease operations, and now seeing how the Russian army is fighting in Ukraine, I have a very different view also about the way how the Red Army made its way into Europe. And I understand certain things that I didn't understand before in terms of the value of life, of their own people and of their own soldiers. And that's you also see at the tactics. It's basically using people as cannon fodder. That story continues, and this is just top of the iceberg. Very many other things actually continue. The way how the World War II, or that segment of the Soviet-German war that is called Great Patriotic War in Russia, is being treated. It's all about glorification, that things were done right, everything was right, everything was correct. And the phrase was, we can repeat it again. That's what they are trying to do in Ukraine. So clearly there has been very little attempt to look in any way critically, not just at the World War II, but also at what followed after that. And what followed after that was occupation of half of Europe. How you deal with that? I remember vividly early 90s and how much hope there were. The belief in miracle, really, that while you remove communism and things would change overnight. The belief in Russian democracy. And I was part of that story. I was part of that excitement. What I know today, what I understand today, is that the societies don't change overnight. There can be a new wonderful leader, and everyone just rushes to support that leader. There can be a period of democratic government, but then it would just go away, and the leader whom you support, like Boris Yeltsin, would create a constitution, super presidential, that became the foundation for next leader, who happened to be Vladimir Putin, to come. So the societies don't change overnight, and the realistic approach to what can happen in Russia in the future has to be there. So there is no quick fix, because this is fixed not just for the wrong leader being there. That's fixed about, and that was in your question, the way how I understand, to the society, to the particular culture that evolved. So it doesn't mean that I don't believe in change. I actually believe that Russia was between 1991 and some place around 2014 was much more free society than was the Soviet Union at any point in its life. But then, so it is a long-term problem with no easy way to fix it. But one thing that we certainly learned from the last 30 years, that our expectations should be measured, that the miracles don't happen, at least don't happen in real life, and base policy for the future on that foundation of lessons that hopefully we learned from this war, but also learned from this post-Soviet transformation. Thank you.
Just, if you don't mind, just very quickly from a personal perspective. So my mom is the youngest of 6 children, and one of her brothers, when he was 17, he was extremely bright, and Moscow had this kind of thing where they made it quite attractive for bright students, etc., to come and join the military academy. So my uncle, my Ukrainian uncle, went to Moscow when he was 17. He married a Lithuanian woman. They had 2 children, and they've been living there, and they used to come and visit us in Kakhovka pretty much every summer with his girls, and he was a military man, but he was also quite gentle, into philosophy, into yoga, he was all of these things. I just want to make a point about how strong that poisonous propaganda has been, that he, who comes from the same family as my mom, and he knows about what they've done to my grandfather, and he was involved in the Lend-Lease. He was driving a Studebaker. He knows what happened to my grandmother, and still in 2014, they started sending us messages saying, about the crucified children of Donbass, a complete fabrication and all of that kind of spewing this propaganda at us. And he came in 2015 for my his sister's funeral, and he mentioned something like, "Oh, Ukrainian is not a real language." How? He's incredibly intelligent. Has always been a gentleman. I just could not understand it. I do not understand how deeply they go into your head, and I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't know how to de-zombify them. Even Ukrainians who, like my uncle, they've been completely poisoned. I don't know how we're going to get rid of that, but they need to lose the war, and they need to recognize all of the stuff that they've done during the Second World War, post-Second World War. All of those Soviet crimes, they need to be recognized internationally and by Russians themselves, and they need to apologize, and they need to, do what Germans did, post 1945. So.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. If we could keep them concise and we'll just get through 2 more.
One for each of you. You mentioned in your introduction about the Ukrainian insurgent army for fighting in the 40s and 50s. My question is this really the second Russia-Ukrainian war? And for you, could you tell us about how the UK is viewed in Ukraine, in particular Boris Johnson?
So what the role of UK was and how do Ukrainians view Boris Johnson? Is that what?
Yeah, Boris Johnson was the second one.
Okay.
I think we might have time because we're going to have two questions from 2 separate people, so we'll take your second. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so your views. I mean, Boris Johnson gets a good rap in your book.
Well, thank you. That is a fun question. Yeah, finally. UK has become really a leader in building, maintaining the coalition of the governments that and peoples and nations that support Ukraine and continue doing that. And there is certainly enormous gratitude for that. That leadership was there early on. It continues. Again, I discuss the British story in the section of the book that is called. It seems to be the British Charge. Yeah, that's the title of the section. And Boris Johnson was there. He was leading that. He is viewed by many in Ukraine, if not as a hero, but certainly as a leader. He was there in Kyiv after the first Western leader, or any leader, it seems to me, to visit Kyiv and visit Zelensky. It was already in April 2022. And I was surprised at that time. I was in May also in UK, and I knew how problematic Boris Johnson is viewed here, and I also knew in what high regard he was held in Ukraine. So the UK really is a hero in that whole story, as it is viewed from Kyiv, as it is viewed from Ukraine, and I want to congratulate you and also to thank for that.
No, thank you for asking. That's an important question in the book.
Hi, thank you both. I was just wondering, following on from what you've both been saying about propaganda in Russia, whether you think that big tech or Western governments should be doing more to fight against disinformation in Russia.
Thank you. Good question.
Okay, you can maybe add that. Yeah. My understanding, again, mostly comes from the presence of the Russian propaganda outside of Russia. I have not been visiting Russia since 2014. Of course, I try to read, I try to follow. And unlike in the US, I remember coming to UK and you check into the hotel and put on your TV set, and there would be Russia Today, and that would be everywhere. And especially after 2014, there was no question. It was a propaganda. It was a propaganda, and it was war propaganda as well. And it was present everywhere, and it wasn't recognized for what it was. In the US, the realization of what was going on, that came only with the presidential elections, which brought Trump to power. That was a wake-up call. And then everyone started to look, okay, what is that, what we are doing with that situation? And it turned out that the Ukrainians were trying to deal with that already for a number of years, with the program Stop Fake and analyzing the news and so on and so forth. So like with very many other things, at least here in the West, the realization of what it was came very, very late. And that's one of the ways of how the liberal democracy and institutions are being used and abused by the authoritarian regime. So that's outside of Russia. Inside of Russia, I just want to echo what Ola was just saying. The situation in which there is the media is completely controlled, which stays on the same message, that gets everyone out there. Where you talk to the neighbor's neighbor, it's an echo chamber. So imagine what is happening with our own bubbles on the Facebook, and now think about the entire society. That's what is happening there. So from that point of view and perspective, again, certainly the change, the transformation of the mind of the society that have been brainwashed for so long and has a long tradition of existence in authoritarian regimes without any extended period of democracy, liberal democracy or otherwise, that's a huge challenge.
Just a very quick point. I've kind of been, being my age, quite involved in social media, and of course, as soon as the war started, I've always been a little bit of a visual person, Instagram, and then as soon as the war started, I joined Twitter. Whew, I know, but you can see how much of that propaganda, of Russian propaganda, it does exist in the Western realm, and if you think about America, and as they call them tankies, and so kind of there's this. It looks like there's this romanticization of the communism and the Soviet kind of years in America, and that's been really tough to kind of to fight. We're all involved in this kind of social media war, information war, and there's a lot of that going on. And it's such a bizarre thing, and it's just like, yes, I also want for there to be social justice. I also want, but do not romanticize this horrific regime, which had absolutely nothing with that idea of communism that you have. So that's been really, really tough to challenge, and but we keep going. We'll keep trying, by telling our personal stories and explaining, and just keep knocking.
It's genuinely upsetting to have to end this conversation. As I said, there is so much more to discuss, but we will have to bring it to an end. I said you chose wisely what to do with your Wednesday evening. I think you will certainly agree. It's just fantastic to have you both, and this mixture of the personal and the political. So thank you both very much. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I'm sure there were many more, and thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you.